Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome to the segment of Code Gurbani's a-sabad-a-day. Our recitation today is the fourth pauri from Gujari Ki War, Mahalla Tija, Guru Amar Das, the third Nanak. And this has two sloks, one composed by the first Nanak, the second one by the third, followed by the pauri, step or ladder, of the third Guru, Guru Amar Das. The first slok is read as Slok Kabir Mukat Duara Sankura Rai Dasweं Paay मन तो में गल होए रहा निक्स्या क्यों कर जाए ऐसा सतगुर जे मिले तुठा करे पसाओ मुकत द्वारा मोकला सहजे आवो जाओ. So now the first slok, I stand corrected, is actually Kabir Ji, Bhagat Kabir. And in Gurbani, you will find there are several instances where a particular message from the Bhagats, notably Kabir Ji and Sheikh Farid, that have been singled out by either the third or the fifth Guru and commented upon in the spirit of dialogue, whether they are expanding on the message or supplementing it, or at times even slightly differing with it, differing with the interpretation rather than the central message. So here, the first slok is from Kabir Ji, and Guru Amar Das then subsequently comments on it. So Kabir is saying, Kabir Mukat Duara Sankura. Sankura means narrow, very small. Rai daswein paay. Rai is a mustard seed. So Kabir is raising a question essentially, but he first begins by telling us that the gateway to freedom, Mukat Duara, is as small as a mustard seed. Rai, Sankura. Indeed, he says, it is as small as a tenth of a mustard seed. Rai daswein paay. So the question is, how can the mind, which is big and drunk like an elephant, and like a drunken elephant, man to megal hoye raha, that is how the mind is. It's drunk with the ego, and it's inflated with the ego, which is why the metaphor of a big elephant. How can an elephant pass through the gateway of freedom, which is as small as a tenth of a mustard seed? So you get the idea. His answer, Aisa Satgur je mila tutta. If only we can find favor with such a Satgur. Tutta means pleasure, the Satgur. If we can find the favor of a Satgur, an enlightened source, Aisa Satgur je mile tutta, and if it is pleased, so pleased, kare pasao, it can educate us to stretch the consciousness of the ego, which is limited and dense. It can diffuse it. Diffusing the ego. Kare pasao. Pasao means to expand. So here it means an expansion of knowledge. And knowledge is of the nature of light, which means the dense mind of the ego becomes the subtle light, wisdom, which has no form, right? So that's the point, that the doorway to liberation is not a physical space, it is subtle, and so therefore the mind has to move beyond ego thinking, which is linked with the senses, which draws from the senses and tends to look within forms and boundaries. We need a boundary in order to be able to extract information about it. So if only we could find favor with a Satgur, that we could go through with ease. In other words, the mind has to become subtle and light like wisdom. And now the third Guru amplifies. He says, Mahalla Tija, Nanak Mukat Duara ati nika, Nanha hoye so jai. How मैं मन यस थूल है क्यों कर विच दे जाए सतगुर मिलिए हाउ मैं गई जोत रही सब आए एह जियो सदा मुक्त है सहजे रहा समाए. So the doorway to liberation, the Guru says, is a subtle pathway. Mukat Duara at Nika. Nika means very subtle. It also means that which is near, the suggestion being that it is within. But what he says is, Nana hoy sujai. Here it means, Nana means small, but it also means knowledge. So the doorway to liberation is a subtle pathway that requires the requisite knowledge, know-how to pass through. Nana hoy sujai. But the mind is barricaded by a gross, inflated ego. How mein man asthula hai. It's not subtle at all. It is gross, it's material. Then how can such a mind pass through? Kyo kar vich dijai? So repeating that question. So now he's clarifying what meeting that enlightened source means. When the Satguru is found, he says, because Kabir had raised the question of if such a Satguru is found who would favor us, Guru Amar Das expands on that by saying, when the Satguru is found, the wall of ego is broken. How mein gai? And it becomes filled, the mind becomes filled with the light of divine awareness. Jyot rahi sab aaye. That's the state of consciousness that the mind naturally gets into. And then Guruji says, this being is eternally liberated. It is always liberated. It is never in any kind of bondage. In other words, it is always in harmony. That is our primal state, but the ego blocks it. And now to the Pauri. Prabh sansar upay ke vas apne kita, ganate prabhu na paiye duje paramita, satgur miliye jivat mare, बुझ सच समीता सबदे हाउ में खोइए हर मेल मिलीता सब किछ जाने करे आप विगसीता. प्रभ संसार उपाय कै. Upay is a solution, a strategy, a stratagem. So the world has come about through a stratagem of the self. And having manifest the world through its stratagem, Prabh Sansar Upay Kay, having done that, it placed the world under its own control. Vas apne kita. Now, this self that does this cannot be understood through any kind of calculation or classification. You can't, because that is how we normally acquire knowledge, is through categorization, through calculation, through classification. We need that hierarchical assembly before we get knowledge out of it. But the Guru says that Prabh cannot be understood through the same mode that you would otherwise employ. Why? Because it does not belong to any category or any faction. Granth Prabhu na paiye. Granth also means a faction, a particular form, a particular category. It is none of these. Not only that, but even if you entertain the thought of applying such a measure of classification or categorization to the self, that very thought is dubious and delusional. Duje paramita. Ganate Prabhu na paya, you can't categorize it, but to think of it is param, is doubt and delusional. And then he tells us how the self is found. The Prabh self is found, experienced again through an enlightened source, Satguru Miliya. Then, when you meet the Satguru, Jivat Mara, the mind dies to the ego, Jivat Mara. And then it is enlightened. And when it is enlightened, it discerns the self. Buj, Sach Samita. So Satgur Miliye Jivat Mare Buj Sach Samita comes into contact with the Satgur. It is enlightened about its own condition. It dies to the ego. It recognizes the ego to just be an abstraction, nothing real. So the Satgur gives you that discernment. So the ego is dissolved by the word, a-sabad-a-day haume koye, spoken by the Satgur, a-sabad-a-day haume koye, har mel melita. That is how it leads to union with the self, union meaning an understanding. And that self is present in everyone, har mel melita, har. Sab kuch jaane kare aap vigasita. So you have to, the realization that we have to take away is that the self is all-knowing, sab kuch jaane. It is the sole cosmic actor, kare aap. It is playing a game. It delights in its own game. Appe vigasita. Vaheguru ji ka khalsa, Vaheguru ji ki fateh.